Winter was spreading like a dark omen over Wessex, while torches burned on the walls of the Anglo-Saxon strongholds. King Edward, heir to the dynasty that had forged the kingdom with blood and iron, now dreamed of something greater: the subjugation of the Norse lands. To him, the Vikings were pests, barbarians to be extirpated from the Christian land. But what he did not know was that, within his own kingdom, shadows moved with patience and purpose. Among the merchants, blacksmiths, and even among the monks of Wessex, men with icy eyes and fierce hearts bided their time. They belonged to a secret order, a silent brotherhood that sought to overthrow Edward and prevent his invasion of the north. Their leader, a man whose name was whispered among allies and feared by enemies, walked among the Anglo-Saxons as one of them, but his soul belonged to the old gods. The court of Wessex rejoiced, confident in its own invincibility, as coded messages traveled between ports and villages. Every piece was being meticulously positioned, for when the first blow was struck, the fires of rebellion would consume the kingdom from within. The war had not yet begun, but in the silence of the conspiracy, it was already being won. Wessex was not just a kingdom, but a symbol of Anglo-Saxon resistance to foreign invaders. For generations, its kings had built walls against the Danes, watched cities burn, and battles become legend. Earlier, Alfred the Great had consolidated the kingdom, repelling the Vikings and laying the foundations for a unified England. Now, years later, his grandson, Edward the Elder, bore the burden of his lineage. He wanted not only to protect Wessex, he wanted to expand it. For Edward, the war against the Norse was not a matter of defense, but of destiny. His kingdom was strong, but not unbreakable. The lands of Wessex were rich, dotted with thriving villages and stone fortresses, where lords loyal to the king ruled with a firm hand. Monasteries guarded treasures and manuscripts, while peasants worked the land, sustaining the king's great war machine. But beneath this apparent stability, cracks were forming. Some nobles questioned the king's obsession with expanding his borders. Others feared that the endless battles would drain the kingdom of its riches. And there were those who whispered, in dark taverns and closed halls, that the revenge of the Norsemen was closer than Edward imagined. The king, however, would not be shaken by doubts. His gaze was fixed on the north, where the Viking clan still reigned free, refusing to bow the knee to his rule. He saw this as an affront. To him, the pagan gods must be eradicated, and the frozen lands of the Norsemen must belong to the English crown. What Edward did not know was that the enemy was already inside his kingdom, watching, waiting. His every decision was analyzed by hidden eyes. His every weakness would be used against him at the right time. The game was moving, and Wessex, so imposing and powerful, might not be as impenetrable as the king believed. Aachen was no ordinary warrior, born under the steel of battle and forged in the cruelty of the sea. He understood that brute force did not always win wars. True victory belonged to those who knew how to wait, to those who infiltrated like shadows before delivering the final blow. His order, known as the Sons of Fenrir, brought together the most cunning and lethal Nordic warriors, but they did not present themselves as invaders. On the contrary, they came under a cloak of redemption, pretending to have abandoned the old gods to embrace the Christian cross. They dressed as merchants and warriors exhausted from endless fighting, men seeking a new life under the protection of King Edward. But behind their submissive eyes and humble words, there was a single truth. They were not there to bow down. Over time, their influence grew. Aachen and his men settled in strategic cities, offering themselves as loyal mercenaries to the crown, and earning the trust of local lords. They attended banquets, protected caravans, and even helped quell small uprisings. King Edward saw them as proof that the pagans could be converted, a symbol of his superiority over the Norse. But while the king slept in his arrogance, the sons of Fenrir sowed the seeds of revolt. In every tavern, a rumor spread. In every village, an ally gained. In the castle corridors, a spy positioned. The plan was clear. When the time was right, Wessex would burn from the inside out. The gates would be opened by the people of the kingdom themselves, tired of the endless war. The dissatisfied lords would be pressured to choose sides. And by the time Edward realized the betrayal, it would be too late. The siege would begin, not with walls scaled, but with bonds broken and alliances broken. And then Aachen would take what was rightfully his. But to do so, he would need to play the game patiently. For the downfall of a king does not come with a single blow of the axe. It begins long before, in the silence of doubt and the poison of distrust. Aachen was born under a sky blackened by the smoke of battle, in a coastal village in the frozen lands of the north. His father, Sigvar, was a feared jarl, known as much for his fury in battle as for his ruthless wisdom. His mother, Frida, was a skald, a storyteller whose words bore the weight of the ancient gods. From an early age, Aachen learned that glory and death went hand in hand, that a man without purpose was but a corpse awaiting his grave. Aachen's childhood was no different from that of other young warriors. He grew up hearing stories of Odin and Thor, of kings who conquered worlds, and of warriors who defied fate itself. But unlike the other boys in his village, Aachen did not simply want to be strong. He wanted to be feared. While others trained to fight, he trained to command. He watched his elders, learned from the mistakes of the warriors before him, and absorbed each lesson as if it were a hot metal being forged in a forge. His first battle came early. At 12, he accompanied his father on a raid against a rival clan. He was too small to fight on the front lines, but big enough to smell the blood. That day, he watched a man being stabbed until his soul left his body. The empty look of the dying man was etched in his mind. He felt no pity, no fear. He felt curiosity. What made a warrior fall? What made him stand? That thought haunted him for years. Aachen grew to become a fierce warrior. By the age of 17, he had killed more men than many jarls had in a lifetime. But it wasn't just his strength that set him apart. It was his mind. He understood that war wasn't just about swords and axes. It was about patience, strategy, manipulation. Then tragedy struck. One treacherous night, his village was attacked by warriors sent by King Harold, who sought to consolidate his power over the northern clans. His father was killed, his mother dragged off as a slave, and Aachen was left to die, wounded, amid the ruins of his burning home. But death did not come for him. He crawled out of the destruction, and at that moment, he swore an oath. He would never fight for a king other than himself. From that day on, Aachen became a lone wolf. He traveled between villages, fought as a mercenary, learned the art of war from different cultures. He spent time in Ireland, where he absorbed the secrets of Celtic spies. On his travels, he heard about England and how manipulable the Saxons were, how their faith blinded them to the true nature of war. He saw an opportunity. If the Saxons could be deceived by gods and empty promises, then perhaps they could be deceived by something much greater. After years of learning, Aachen returned to the north. But he did not return to be a mere warrior. He returned to forge something new. He gathered together those who, like him, had been betrayed by kings and gods. Men who had lost their families, who had been exiled, who had no homeland but hatred and ambition. He gave them a purpose, not just to plunder, but to conquer, not just to fight, but to infiltrate. He named them the sons of Fenrir, after the monstrous wolf who, according to legend, was destined to devour the gods at Ragnarok. For, like Fenrir, Aachen and his men would not be content with small plunder. They would devour entire kingdoms. Dressed in sheep's clothing, they crossed the sea and reached Wessex. They posed as repentant Norsemen, warriors who longed for a new life under the protection of King Edward. They knew that the Saxons viewed the Vikings as barbarians, but also as potential converts to the Christian faith. Aachen used this to his advantage. With well-placed words and calculated actions, he began to sow the seeds of the king's downfall. For a good warrior can win a battle, but only a strategist can bring down an empire. The sons of Fenrir were not just warriors. They were shadows that moved among the Anglo-Saxons, wolves in sheep's clothing. Formed by Aachen, the order was born out of the need to create a structured and lethal resistance to Christian rule. Unlike the impulsive Viking raids and disorganized raids, the sons of Fenrir followed strict codes, inspired by the wolf god of destruction himself. Their oath was simple: loyalty to brother, blood for blood, absolute silence. Betrayal meant death. Those who joined the order underwent brutal rites, forced to endure extreme pain, hunger, and cold, strengthening both body and mind. They infiltrated villages, learned their customs, feigned conversion to Christianity, all the while mapping fortresses, studying supply routes, and earning the trust of Saxon nobles. Their method was not just force, but cunning. They worked as mercenaries for landowners, swearing loyalty to King Edward, becoming soldiers in his own guard, while passing on vital information to their hidden brothers. Some missions involved poisoning Saxon commanders, strategic arson, and the gradual weakening of Wessex's defenses. The order communicated through symbols carved into wood and bone, encrypted messages that only its members could interpret. The sons of Fenrir's connection to Ubba Ragnarsson was a closely guarded secret. Ubba, son of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, carried within himself the flame of revenge for his father's death and the need to expand the Norse presence in England. He saw Aachen's order as a powerful weapon. For years, Ubba financed their operations in secret, providing gold, weapons, and valuable information. The sons of Fenrir were not just soldiers for his cause, but vengeful spirits of Odin's line, ready to cut short Edward's reign and transform Wessex into a Viking domain. The noose was closing in, but a single mistake could ruin everything. It was a cold night, the stars shining like mirrors in the sky. But in Wessex, the stillness was broken only by the whispers of the winds that dragged the snow through the trees. The monastery of St. Aldhelm, isolated and built on the banks of a narrow river, was a fortress of stone and faith. But beneath its calm and sacred appearance, a secret was hidden. Its walls would welcome a Viking troop, led by Ubba Ragnarsson, who was about to take the first step in an audacious plan to conquer the heart of the kingdom of Wessex. There, in that monastery, the sons of Fenrir would show their true strength. The monastery of St. Aldhelm was not only a refuge for monks and religious, but also a strategic supply point for the armies of Wessex. Edward, the king, with his plan for expansionism, had ordered a small garrison of Saxon soldiers to be installed there, with orders to patrol the region and ensure that no Viking dared to invade their lands. The garrison commander, Ethelred, was a stern and watchful man who never doubted his own abilities, but he was about to underestimate the men who were now infiltrating his territory. Aachen, leader of the sons of Fenrir, knew this. He had planned every detail meticulously, from the silent entry into the region to the disposition of the troops at the moment of action. The order, which until then had acted as disguised shadows, was preparing for an audacious assault. On a cold winter night, the order received the latest in a series of coded messages from Ubba Ragnarsson, informing them that the Wessex troops were being moved to a distant city for combat, leaving the monastery vulnerable. It was the perfect moment for the sons of Fenrir to seize control and begin the siege of Wessex. As the assault approached, Aachen gathered his best warriors. They knew what was at stake. The attack would be swift and deadly, driven by a non-negotiable purpose: the destruction of King Edward and the strengthening of the Viking lineage in Anglo-Saxon lands. The monastery, though imposing and surrounded by forests, was unprepared for the approaching stealth attack. The river crossing, once a natural obstacle to invasion, turned into a strategic advantage. The sons of Fenrir, men experienced in night fighting, used small, silent boats equipped only with oars and sails to cross the water and approach the monastery undetected. Meanwhile, within the monastery walls, the Saxon soldiers, confident that the Viking threat had dissipated for a time, were intoxicated by the tranquility of the night. Many were resting after a long day of patrolling, and others had retired to their beds, relaxed by the knowledge that, being within a protected and sacred place, they were safe from any attack. But Aachen and his sons of Fenrir knew that overconfidence was the biggest mistake an army could make. The plan was clear. The sons of Fenrir would enter the monastery at night and, in one swift attack, take control of the entire place. Aachen, who stood at the front line with his broadsword and the distinctive wolf carved into his belt, gave the signal for the attack. With a silent cry, his troops advanced. The first part of the strategy was crucial, destroying the sentries on the monastery towers. In one perfect move, the sons of Fenrir used ropes and ladders to scale the walls, catching the guards by surprise and immobilizing them before they could make a sound. At the same time, a small unit was sent to the granary, where food and supplies were stored. The goal was to set the area on fire and spread panic. The idea was to create confusion, causing the Saxon soldiers to scatter, while the true objectives of the mission were realized. The moment of shock came with a bang. By the time the sons of Fenrir burst into the monastery's main hall, the battle was already in full swing. Steel blades sliced through the air, the smell of blood and sweat mingling with the incense that still hung from the stone columns. The monks, mostly peaceful and religious, were caught completely off guard. Some tried to hide in the inner chambers, while others were so terrified they could barely beg for mercy. But for Aachen and his warriors, there was no mercy. The sons of Fenrir were there for one purpose: to capture the monastery and use its strategic location for their future campaigns. The fighting inside the monastery was brutal. The Vikings' skill in hand-to-hand combat and their psychological resilience training proved decisive. Aachen, with his unflappable calm, was the first to enter the large room of the prayer hall, where many of the Saxon soldiers had gathered to plan Edward's next moves. The surprise was so great that many of the soldiers were unable to react in time. Aachen, with his sharp sword, cut through the enemy ranks, cutting down soldiers one by one. Beside him, the warriors of his order, ruthless men trained for war, fought fiercely. During the confrontation, Ethelred, the Saxon commander, tried to rally his forces and make a stand, but the disorganization of the attack and the surprise caught him at a disadvantage. In an attempt to protect the monastery, he ordered the soldiers to form a defensive line around the main entrance. However, Aachen had already mapped every route and every weak point of the fortress. A second unit of sons of Fenrir, strategically positioned in the towers, began to fire arrows, setting parts of the structure ablaze and further disorienting the Saxons. When the first rays of light began to appear on the horizon, the monastery was in ruins. The ground was covered with the bodies of Saxon soldiers and monks, and the air was thick with smoke from the fires. But the mission was far from over. Aachen, with his cold and implacable eyes, had another task in mind. This was not just a physical battle, but a strategic move towards the domination of Wessex. The capture of the monastery was not an end in itself, but the first step in a long march. Ubba Ragnarson's troops, who had not yet arrived, would be greeted with a fortress now under the control of the sons of Fenrir. More than a victory, this raid was a clear sign that the Vikings were ready to take Wessex, step by step, weakening every inch of the kingdom until finally the land was at the mercy of their invaders. Aachen knew that with Ubba's help, he could overthrow Edward and bring the Anglo-Saxon king's lands into the age of the sons of Fenrir. The monastery, now in Viking hands, would become a symbol of resistance. Its strategic location and the resources stored there would be crucial to the sons of Fenrir's next moves as the siege of Wessex began. The war was far from over, but the sons of Fenrir had taken the first and bloodiest step on their journey to domination. And for Aachen, the unbeatable leader, victory at St. Aldhelm's monastery would be just the beginning of a new Viking age. The monastery of St. Aldhelm, once a symbol of faith and tranquility for the Saxons, was now a stronghold of Viking strength, and its capture by the sons of Fenrir marked the beginning of meticulous preparations. Aachen, aware that this first victory was only one piece in a larger game, knew that the next step would be crucial to securing the dominance of Wessex. Control of the monastery represented not only a military victory, but a strategic lever for the sons of Fenrir, who would soon begin to move to consolidate their presence and expand their strength. Following the victory at St. Aldhelm, Aachen ordered the monastery to be fortified. The sons of Fenrir knew that although the monastery was well positioned, it still did not offer absolute security against a possible Saxon counteroffensive. The walls were reinforced with oak timbers brought from the nearby forests, and the fields around the fortress were meticulously guarded. Traps were placed along the trails and at the monastery's exits to ensure that no enemy patrol could sneak in undetected. Meanwhile, within the monastery walls, the Viking warriors trained fiercely. Aachen, unfazed, supervised every movement, every exercise. He knew that their strength came not only from their numbers, but from the discipline with which they followed his commands. The combat drills were grueling. The sons of Fenrir practiced group attacks, tactical coordination, and hand-to-hand combat daily. The spirit of unity among the men had never been stronger. Each of them knew that their next target would not be an isolated monastery, but the very heart of Wessex, Edward's kingdom. Months passed and, as planned, the troops of Ubba Ragnarsson, Ragnar Lothbrok's son, began to arrive. Ubba, with his strength and reputation, brought with him formidable warriors and siege weapons that were essential for the next stages of the campaign. Their ships, loaded with men and resources, arrived in small groups during the period, to avoid attracting attention. Each vessel was carefully hidden in the most remote bays and then pulled ashore. Ubba, although far from the final great battle, had a vital role to play. He would ensure that the sons of Fenrir not only remained strong, but also increased their power. He brought with him treasures plundered from his recent campaigns, which would be used to attract more allies and keep the troops well fed and equipped. In addition, his skills with war machines, such as catapults and siege towers, were well known. Ubba's presence not only bolstered the confidence of the sons of Fenrir, but also solidified the alliance with other Norse tribes who had pledged to help bring about Edward's downfall. Ubba, with his imposing style and fearless leader personality, soon became a central figure in Aachen's planning. Having lived through many battles and seen kingdoms fall, he knew that the siege of Wessex would require more than just military strength. It would require intelligence, patience, and a well-crafted strategy. The two leaders, Aachen and Ubba, spent long hours discussing the next steps, outlining the details of the attack and dividing resources to ensure that nothing was left to chance. Every move had to be calculated with precision, for a mistake could mean the loss of the advantage gained. The sons of Fenrir, over these months of preparation, also strengthened alliances with other Viking groups and local clans. The Norse tribes of the lands to the north joined the cause, knowing that if Edward fell, the lands to the south would be open to further conquest. The sons of Fenrir recruited not only warriors, but also mercenaries and even small groups of disaffected people with Edward's reign, those who, for whatever reason, saw the king's downfall as an opportunity to rise through the ranks of a new Viking government. These alliances were essential to ensuring that the siege of Wessex had sufficient support, both in terms of numbers and resources. Viking scouts, who had been sent into the forests surrounding Wessex, brought back detailed reports of the situation within the kingdom. They informed Aachen about the morale of Edward's troops, the weak points in the territory, and most importantly, the condition of the fortresses in Wessex. Aachen began to realize that the Anglo-Saxon king, though powerful, was focused on expanding his domains and neglecting some of the more distant borders of his kingdom, something that could be exploited by the sons of Fenrir. As more of Ubba's troops arrived and his forces grew stronger, Aachen also began to infiltrate Wessex with secret agents. Spies disguised as merchants, pilgrims, and peasants began to work within the kingdom, providing crucial information about internal politics and disputes in Canterbury and Wessex itself. Many Anglo-Saxon nobles, especially those who ruled over outlying lands, were dissatisfied with Edward's growing power and his campaigns of expansion. Some were even willing to ally themselves with the Vikings, believing that the king's rise would mean a diminution of their own influence. Aachen, with his keen eye, began to notice a growing network of dissent within the kingdom. These internal tensions among the Anglo-Saxon nobles could be exploited by the sons of Fenrir. More than a simple military attack, Edward's downfall could be facilitated if his own allies began to question his leadership. In this scenario, the war would become not just a sword fight, but a battle for the trust and loyalty of Edward's own subjects. With the arrival of more resources, weapons, and allies, Aachen and Ubba focused all their efforts on creating an unbeatable siege. They began building siege towers and catapults to prepare for a heavy assault on the walls of Wessex. In addition, supply routes were carefully planned, ensuring that the Viking forces would not suffer from shortages of supplies during the advance. The logistics of a siege of this magnitude required meticulous attention to detail, and Aachen knew he could not fail. Meanwhile, the sons of Fenrir troops continued to train and practice coordination. Aachen, Ubba, and their advisors met on several occasions to review the strategy and ensure that all warriors were ready for what was to come. The mission to overthrow Edward was within reach, and every action of the sons of Fenrir was aimed at ensuring that when they struck Wessex, the blow would be fatal and final. The great assault on Wessex. Now, with all the pieces in place, Ubba's troops, the Viking alliances, the infiltrated spies, and the siege engines, Aachen was ready to strike. The Viking forces were united, the strategies tested, and the time to overthrow King Edward had come. The final battle for Wessex would soon begin. Aachen looked at his assembled troops and, with a gesture of determination, raised his sword. He knew that in beginning this campaign, not only the future of Wessex was at stake, but the fate of all England. His name, Aachen, would echo through the centuries, not only as a Viking leader, but as the man who helped redirect the course of history. With their preparations complete, the next action of the sons of Fenrir would be decisive. The siege of Wessex would begin, and with it, the future of the entire kingdom. The attack on Wessex was a blow that would echo through history, not just as a bloody battle, but as the collapse of an empire. Aachen and his sons of Fenrir knew that this would be the decisive action, the turning point that would mark the end of the dynasty of Edward, the Anglo-Saxon king. The siege had been prepared with precision. The war machines were assembled, the troops were drawn up in formation, and the battle plan was clear. But most important of all was the spirit of unity and vengeance that drove every Viking warrior. The night before the attack was shrouded in silence. the kind of stillness before a storm. The sons of Fenrir troops were positioned along the hills surrounding Wessex, hidden in shadow. The alliance with Ubba Ragnarsson had reinforced Akin's confidence in his leadership, and he knew that at the first sign of dawn, war would begin. At dawn, the Vikings launched their offensive. Suddenly, like thunder splitting the sky, Akin's warriors descended from the hills, advancing with a fierce roar. The first lines of attack were a wing of archers and stone throwers, who fired at the city walls. Tempers were high, and the rain of arrows seemed endless. This was not just an attack, but a message. Wessex was being invaded, and Edward could do nothing to stop them. The sons of Fenrir were known for their brutality, and the battle quickly turned into a melee. With their axes and swords, the Vikings broke through the Saxon defenses, their onslaught so fierce that Edward's forces began to fall apart. The catapults and siege towers, built over months of preparation, began to hurl massive stones at the Wessex fortifications, cracking the walls and wreaking havoc. As the battle raged around the walls, Ubba's forces took up positions at strategic points around the city. The Viking leader had commanded his troops with precision, and his siege towers were advancing on the gates of Wessex. The city, once an imposing fortress, was now at the mercy of the Viking force. With each advance of Akin's troops a march closer to victory. Inside the city, Edward and his commanders were in a panic. News of the attack quickly reached the royal palace, and Edward was forced to rally his forces to try to resist the siege. But the Vikings, with their ruthless tactics and brutal force, were advancing in all directions. Edward knew he could not maintain control for long, especially with Akin's forces growing by the minute. The battle reached its climax when Ubba's troops reached the central square of Wessex and began to wreak havoc among Edward's soldiers. The battlefield looked like a massive carnage, with the bodies of the fallen strewn everywhere, while the Vikings advanced mercilessly. Akin, mounted on his horse, commanded the battle with an undeniable presence. He watched every move of his troops and adjusted his strategies as necessary. His soul was focused on one goal, the fall of Edward, the king who had so threatened his homeland and his honor. Edward's forces were crumbling, and the Vikings, with their unbeatable tenacity, were taking every inch of the city. The battle culminated in an epic clash in front of the royal palace. Edward, desperate, armed himself with his sword and gathered his most loyal men to try to face Akin. The fight was intense, with the sound of swords and axes clashing in the air, but the sons of Fenrir were an irresistible force. Edward, despite his courage, could not keep up with the Viking momentum. The war was not just physical. It was a war for the soul of Wessex, and Akin knew it with every fiber of his being. At the decisive moment, when Edward was surrounded by a dozen Vikings, Akin struck the final blow. He charged forward alone, defying any who would dare to stand in his way. The ensuing battle was brutal, but it did not last long. Akin, with a swift, sure move, disarmed Edward and, with a slash of his sharp blade, drove his sword into the king's chest. Edward's blood spattered the sacred soil of Wessex as the victorious Vikings roared in celebration. Edward's death was the end of an era. The Anglo-Saxon king who had sought to expand his lands and subdue the Vikings was now fallen, his kingdom shattered. Akin, kneeling before the king's body, paused, surveying the empire he had just conquered. There was no jubilation on Akin's face, only a sense of accomplishment. It was the price he and his men had paid to overthrow Edward and take over the kingdom. With Edward's death, Wessex fell under the control of the sons of Fenrir. The city was sacked, its treasures and riches taken as prizes for the Vikings. The fearful Saxon population was forced to submit to their new rulers. Akin, though victorious, knew that this conquest was only the beginning. The kingdom of Wessex was now in the hands of the Vikings, But the future was still uncertain. As his men celebrated their victory, Aachen looked to the horizon. His gaze drifted away from the conquered city, his thoughts returning to the distant lands that still needed to be conquered, to the enemies that were yet to come. The journey of the sons of Fenrir was not complete, and there were many paths ahead, filled with challenges and new battles. But for now, the kingdom of Wessex lay at the feet of the sons of Fenrir, and Aachen knew that the future was in his hands. They had overthrown a king, destroyed an empire, and now they prepared for new challenges. The story of Aachen and his sons of Fenrir was far from over. A new journey awaited. But that was a story for another time. And so, with the fall of Edward and the capture of Wessex, the sons of Fenrir were poised for a new era, one forged by steel, courage, and the unstoppable strength of the Vikings. Did you like this story? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next epic sagas. The journey continues.